Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining for my first recorded workshop, Saturn Return for the Natal Saturn and Pisces. My name is Mina, and I have been training as a professional astrologer for almost 4 years now. And I am excited to share this presentation with you all, especially those of you who are like me, who are natal Saturn and Pisces, who will be experiencing our first Saturn return when Saturn transits into Pisces for the first time in 28 years in March of 2023. So in about 3 months. Holding this space because I, like many people, am anticipating and preparing and thinking about what my first Saturn return will mean for me, as well as thinking about what the current transits that we've been experiencing, specifically Neptune that has been in Pisces for a few years now, and Jupiter that has been in Pisces over 3 distinct periods, which we'll talk about later today, since summer of 2021, what those transits, how they can inform and prepare us for the upcoming Saturn in Pisces, and how it has already started to illuminate some of the themes and some of the areas of my life where my Saturn in Pisces is located. And I wanted to share some of those teachings and some of the things that I've been reflecting on with other people and with my fellow Saturn and Pisces. So before I jump right into the content of what this presentation will be all about, I want to start by asking people who are listening to this recording, if you like to take a moment, maybe even pause the recording, and answer this question. You can either journal about it, draw a response to this question, or maybe meditate and reflect on your response to this question. But the question is, what has brought you to this presentation today? And what do you hope to get out of this presentation? So what has brought you to wanting to know more about your Saturn return, and what are you hoping to get out of your engagement with this presentation? So a brief overview of the agenda for this presentation. We'll start by talking a little bit about the mythology around Saturn and the Saturn in Pisces archetype. We'll talk about how Saturn in Pisces shows up in your life based on the natal position of where Saturn in Pisces is in your particular chart. And we'll reflect on how the current transits are watering the ground, so to speak, for our upcoming Saturn return when Saturn transits into Pisces. So as people probably know, the planets in astrology and also in our popular culture are named after Greco-Roman gods. They're named after deities. And holding this fact, holding this reality is really important when we think about what the planets mean in our astrological interpretations, how they structure and contour and guide particular forces, particular repeated patterns, and particular challenges or opportunities that we may face and choices that we may have in this lifetime. And also understanding that because these planetary astrological interpretations in the Western astrological tradition do come from a particular culture and a particular tradition that has existed for thousands and thousands of years. And also, if you believe in the kind of universality of the planetary archetypes that has existed across many cultures, it's really helpful in thinking about how do we understand these planetary archetypes and how they show up in our lives and in our culture. It's really important to go back to that mythology, go back to those stories that are thousands of years old that humans have told each other, have passed down from generations to generations, to explain and to better understand and to better interpret how these planetary archetypes do show up in our charts and in the astrological tradition. And that's why for me, it's really important to kind of open up the space and open up our reflection and meditation on our own charts and how this Saturn return is going to kind of affect our lives, to open up that space and to really ground it in mythology. Mythology to me is a tool that we can use to tell a story that, while not literally true, or we may not believe it to be literally true, in the kind of archetypical symbolic level, is able to pierce some subconscious part of ourselves that understands the truth in that story, that understands the meaning in that story, that can identify with the characters, that can identify with their motivations, their feelings, and their emotions, to see how that does in fact translate to our own lives and to how we experience these energies today. So when we think about Saturn specifically, and the mythology, particularly coming out of the Greco-Roman tradition, that Saturn is most known for, they're usually pretty kind of negative tropes about Saturn, both mythological and also in our popular culture, which is why people have so much apprehension about the Saturn return, because they associate Saturn with our kind of popular cultural bias, I would say, against Saturn. So the two kind of I think of as the most popular myths around Saturn is one, when Kronos, which is the Greek name for Saturn, Saturn is the Roman name, when Kronos castrated his own father, Uranus, and then threw his father's phallus into the sea, and then out of the sea came the green foam, from which Aphrodite, who was the Greek name for Venus, was born. So that's the kind of first very popular mythology around Saturn. And then the second mythology around Saturn that is usually interpreted in a very kind of negative way is when Kronos kind of believed or found out that his own children, which included Zeus or Jupiter, Pluto or Hades, were going to overthrow him. We're going to overthrow the Titans, which was kind of the class of deities that Kronos belonged to. He tried to swallow his own children. To keep them from coming into power, which is actually a really common theme in the Greco-Roman tradition. Its sons have to kind of kill or castrate, in some sense, their fathers in order for the next generation to kind of ascend into power. And it's one example of, I think, a theme in kind of the Greco-Roman Western canon that is not necessarily universal and doesn't necessarily exist in every culture in that way, but it is a really common theme that the younger generations have to overthrow the older generations, usually through some kind of force, in order to kind of take their rightful place in power. So backing up a little bit, then what happens is that Zeus's mother kind of hides him away from Kronos, and he's able, with the help of his brother Hades or Pluto, to overthrow the Titans, overthrow Kronos, and then it kind of ushers in the era of the Olympians and that pantheon of deities led by Zeus or Jupiter. So if you look at these two myths about Saturn, they're pretty negative. The first one is Saturn kind of violently, castrating his father, throwing the phallus into the sea. And the second one is him trying to kind of thwart the destiny and the potential of his own children by killing them, by swallowing them. They're very negative archetypes. But if we kind of back up and unpack these two mythologies around Saturn and really try and understand the story from Saturn's perspective, and really give kind of a different perspective to the Saturn archetype based on what would these two stories look like from Saturn's perspective, or what did they look like from Saturn's perspective. Maybe there are some lessons there. Maybe there is some light and a lot of the shadow that we're aware of in the Saturn archetype. Maybe we can find that light in order to in our own lives more agentfully hold both of those pieces, more agentfully be able to hold kind of the light and the shadow of the Saturn archetype as we, the natal Saturn of Pisces, kind of move into a particularly Saturnian period of our own lives. So if we look at the first mythology, the one where Saturn castrates his own father, Uranus, who is also a planet, the first kind of outer planet after Saturn, in that mythology, Uranus is one of the first sky gods. So he's a very early kind of God the Father creator figure who resides in the sky. And he's married to Gaia, who is the earth goddess and the goddess of fertility and of the earth. And what Uranus is doing is he goes and he impregnates Gaia, and she births all these children. One of these children is Cronus, one of these children is Saturn. And Uranus, he's not like into fatherhood. He doesn't really want to be a very present father. He's into the act of creating life, that kind of create the idea of it, but he doesn't really want to do like the work of actually like being a present father. So he kills off all of his children because he doesn't want to raise them. And he then reimpregnates Gaia. She births more children for him, and then he kills them off. And this obviously is like completely devastating to Gaia, to, you know, all the laboring that she does to birth these children into the world, only for her husband, the sky god, to kill them. And so Kronos, who's a child at this time, sees his mother Gaia in grief and pain and emotional pain over having, you know, this relationship that she has with Uranus, where he impregnates her, she gives birth to their children, he kills them off. He sees his mother, Cronus sees his mother in pain, and he decides that he's going to castrate Uranus to stop Uranus from being able to impregnate Gaia. In this mythology, it's a very interesting relationship. If you know anything about the archetype of Uranus and the archetype of Saturn, it's an interesting relationship between the two, right? That Saturn, in some ways, is the principle that comes in and kind of castrates, for lack of a better word, the kind of mental, creative, imaginative, future-oriented Uranus. And how sometimes that's how life actually works, right? That like we have all these ideas about what it is that we want to do, that we can do, that is very Uranus in nature. It exists very much in the mental space. But then Saturn, which represents our very real kind of earthly limitations and boundaries and the principle of no, come in and they kind of stop those ideas, or they say, oh, that's not practical, maybe that can't happen, and that relationship between Saturn and Uranus. So Saturn, as a child, castrates his own father, throws his phallus into the ocean in order to protect his mother, who he's protecting from the grief of bearing these children into the world and having them killed off by this sky god, who really doesn't care about like the messy material details of what it would really mean to like care for and nurture your creation, is just kind of mentally interested in the idea of creativity, but doesn't really want to do the work. And so Saturn is that principle that says, you know, actually, no, like if you don't want to actually be responsible for your creations, then you can't create anymore. And that in a lot of ways is kind of Saturn, and another way of thinking about the Saturn archetype. So if we look at the second mythology, the second story that is most closely associated with Saturn, the story where Saturn, I believe, he receives this message from an oracle. Don't exactly quote me on that. I'm not 100% sure, but he does receive this message that his children will overthrow him. It will be the end of the Titans and the kind of beginning of a new like pantheon of deities. If we look at that story and we kind of try and understand it from Saturn's perspective, what are some of the different kind of lessons or different kind of interpretations can we have for the Saturn archetype? So Saturn rules natural time and this kind of seasonal cyclical nature of natural time and the fealty to natural time, and particularly the kind of agricultural cycle and humans kind of fealty and dependence on and kind of living within natural time. And that's why the Saturn archetype is associated with father time. That's often why you see Saturn depicted with a scythe, so a tool of a farmer, because Saturn represents humans tie to the natural time cycles, tied to the land and our fealty to it. And so it's possible in some interpretations of this myth, it's possible that Saturn knew that when his son Zeus, Jupiter took over and ushered in the new era of the Olympians, that that was the kind of first movement away, human movement away from natural time and the kind of polytheistic, like, for lack of a better word, pagan religions that were tied to the mother goddess archetype, that were tied to the land, that were tied to natural cycles, and that the rule of the Olympians within the kind of Greco-Roman Western tradition, that Western astrology and those of us who you know, through our various kinds of histories are now inextricably linked to the Western tradition, that would be the movement away from this this particular relationship that humans have to nature, and toward a more kind of monotheistic, right? Because Zeus, Jupiter, is the archetype of the kind of monotheistic god that Western tradition was moving into, and that point within our kind of cosmological history also started the our path toward, you know, enlightenment, post-enlightenment ideas about man himself being a god, being a sky god that kind of sits on top of Earth and can control and can kind of do with nature what we want, and kind of the severing of our relationship to these natural time cycle, these natural cycles of time. And so it's possible that Saturn understood what it would mean for this new era to come into being. He knew what it was that we were losing as human beings by severing ourselves from our connection to natural time and our connection to the land. And in order to try and prevent that, he tried to kill his own children. Maybe a misguided way of going about it, but maybe that's what Saturn was thinking in his attempt to try and keep the era of the Olympians from coming into being. So if we take these two mythologies together, the one where Saturn is castrating his own father and the one where Saturn is trying to kill his children, and we take these two mythologies from Saturn's perspective and we try and see what themes come out of it, the shadow of which I think is very much understood and very much appreciated within our popular culture and our popular discourse, but maybe the other side of it is not as understood or not as appreciated. We see that Saturn as a patriarchal figure, as a patriarch, is tied to our relationship to the earth, relationship to our principle of the divine feminine. It's tied to our relationship to natural order, our fealty to natural time. Can be tied to the sensual, can be tied to the earthbound and the material, and can be tied to kind of the old or traditional, but by traditional, I mean primitive, right? Pre-modernity ways of being, and that Saturn can see himself or does see himself as the protector of that old, primitive, prehistoric time and way of being. And if we understand Saturn in that way, that what Saturn is trying to do is to return us back to a time where we had fealty to the natural order and to the natural ways of being, and how our modern culture and just the reality of our modern culture is really against that happening, we can see why Saturn in our popular culture and our popular understanding has such a negative reputation and is always seen as the bad guy and is always seen as a villain and is always seen as trying to castrate our creative, imaginative, mental genius principle represented by Uranus, or a kind of ambitious, reach for the skies, you are master of your own fate, Jupiter principle, and the kind of strange relationship that Saturn has with those two principles makes a little bit more sense. And also the work that Saturn is trying to do in our own lives starts to make a little bit more sense when we take these two mythologies and we kind of flip them a little bit and see them in a different way. So now that we've built a bit of a foundation in understanding the mythology, which I always like to start with the mythology before going straight into the kind of, what astrologers will call the kind of cookbook, keywords for certain astrological interpretations. I like to start with the astrology, or not the astrology. I like to start with the mythology because I think that it opens up our psyche and opens up the kind of part of ourself that's ready to receive the mystical and ready to receive the spiritual in a different way than if we were just to start with kind of the keyword phrases and say, okay, Saturn is this, this, and this, and Pisces is this, this, and this. Let's put them together. That's Saturn and Pisces. When we start with the mythology and we kind of tell stories about how these archetypes show up for us and show up in our lives, I think we get, we're a little bit more open psychologically to receiving kind of a deeper message. So going into the keywords when we think about Saturn and the archetype of Saturn, which we have gone over a few of them already when we're talking about mythology. Father Time. Saturn is a principle of time. Both that time is a form of boundary, of limitation that we will all experience, but also Saturn in its more positive light is the concept that like time is the ultimate medicine. And time heals everything, and things kind of show up in their own time. So again, if we remember Saturn as kind of the farmer, the idea of seasonal rhythms of life, the crops grow in their own time. And if we trust that natural time cycle, we can receive the gifts that are really meant for us. So Saturn is father time. Saturn is also maturation. So it's this idea that everyone gets older and everything gets older. And that's a huge theme of the Saturn return, is this idea of maturation, of coming into your full kind of adult self. Saturn is adulting. Adulting both as maturation, growing up, but also like the responsibilities and the obligations and the duty that comes with adulting. Saturn represents growth through discipline. So Saturn, the great thing about Saturn, unlike some of the outer planets who, it really doesn't matter what you do, they're just going to have their way with you one way or the other. Saturn does in fact reward hard work. Saturn does say if you kind of do the hard work, you do the steps, you stay disciplined, you stay focused, you will get the reward on the other side. And that is one kind of aspect of Saturn is growth through discipline. Saturn's also delayed gratification. So with the same kind of themes of time, of maturation, of responsibilities, of growth through discipline, Saturn represents delayed gratification. So it represents this principle that you may do the hard work for a very, very, very long time and not get the reward till much later on. Saturn is a principle of you reap what you sow. The seeds that you plant is what will grow and what will show up for you. And like I said, Saturn is hard work pays off, right? So Saturn is asking you to do the hard work in order to get the reward. But Saturn is not, unlike some of the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, for example, Saturn's not hiding the ball, right, about what you need to do to get what you're trying to get. But it is very demanding, and it is asking a lot of you. So now that we've spent a lot of time talking about Saturn, which, remembering again, Saturn, the planets in astrology are like, they're named after deities. So they have the kind of force of personality and the creative kind of agency. And they're really the agentful principles in astrology. And the signs The zodiacal signs are more the quality and the kind of expressive medium through which the planets, as the personalities, act through. So a quick introduction to the 12 signs of the zodiac. Could be a much longer topic and a much longer presentation. But the 12 signs of the zodiac represent in some ways, as what I like to call the path, well, not what I like to call, what astrologers like to call, that I've borrowed, a path of psychosocial and psychospiritual development. So you start with Aries, which is kind of the moment of birth. It's a fire sign, so it's like the big bang, the spark that kind of motivates the soul. That is kind of in an undifferentiated miasma, or even floating around undifferentiated in the womb to be born, and to be born an individual, which is Aries, that principle of individuality. And Taurus is the corporal body and the need to kind of sustain one's own life materially. And so everything that comes with that, food, money, the body, resources, are kind of in the realm of Taurus. Then Gemini is the ability to think, the mental plane, and also to communicate, to speak a language, and to be able to have shared language with other people. So the first kind of bits of socialization happen in Gemini. Cancer is the first water sign, so it's the emotive and the plane of emotions and bonding and attaching. And so Cancer represents the family and the family of origin, and the first kind of emotive and affective bonds that we have with people. Leo, the second fire sign, represents our individuality and our need to kind of express ourselves as individuals and to be recognized by others as unique and special individuals. Then when we get to Virgo, we are learning skills, and we're learning to take our kind of creative impulse that started in Leo and really work at defining our skills and being able to do something that is useful for other people. And then when we get to Libra, Libra is all about relationships, and particularly kind of like mature relationships and our one-on-one interactions and socialization, and being able to socialize. It's another air sign, being able to socialize and build those one-on-one relationships. Scorpio is a water sign, and it is our need for kind of, I would say, more mature, more adult, bonded, attached relationships, and all the kind of feelings. One way that's 8th house Scorpio is talked about is like the emotional consequences of relationships. So even some of the darker or uglier emotions that come out of relationship. Then we move to Sagittarius, which is the third fire sign, and it's our ability to expand the self by seeking higher knowledge, by seeking new experiences. Oversimplification, but new experiences. And then Capricorn is our ability to be responsible in the world and have a kind of profession or career or vocation that is how we are responsible for ourselves and for and for our place in the world. And Aquarius is the third air sign, and it is sociality, but in a more broader kind of transpersonal sense. And so it is tied to kind of social ideology, social groups, and our ability to kind of connect on the mental plane, again, in a more transpersonal, while Libra is more interpersonal, Aquarius is more transpersonal. And then we hit the 12th sign, Pisces, the sign that we're going to spend a lot of time with. It's the third water sign. And if Aquarius as an earth sign, as an air sign, sorry, Aquarius as an air sign is transpersonal kind of social ideas and ideology. And Pisces is our transpersonal ability, the transpersonal ability to connect on an emotional, affective, empathetic, compassionate, and spiritual plane. And so Pisces in some ways is both the beginning and the end of the cycle of psychosocial and psychospiritual development. We're out of Pisces. We're kind of this undifferentiated miasma. We're in the primordial gunk of the pre kind of conscious plane, and then we kind of burst, out through Aries into kind of our individual existence. We move through all the 12 phases, and then we end in Pisces, which is the more kind of universal, all, connection with the universe and connection with all that is, and that kind of state of deep kind of spiritual ascendancy, which is itself again can be an undifferentiated space, but in its more high resonant form. So that's just an introduction to the 12 signs of the zodiac, and how I think about them as the wheel of psychosocial and psychospiritual development. And we'll be talking more about Pisces, and particularly Saturn and Pisces, the topic, obviously, of this presentation. So talking a little bit more about Pisces. Pisces is a water sign, which means it's attuned to the emotional, to the intuitive, to the kind of soul, spiritual plane of existence. And it's also mutable, which we can have a much longer presentation, a much longer discussion on like the elements. Pisces is a water sign, and the modalities, Pisces is mutable. But basically, it means that Pisces is water in its flowing, spreading, oceanic form. And so Pisces is associated with dreams, with fantasy, with illusion. It is associated with connection with the divine, with our collective and universal unconscious. Pisces is associated with our deep feeling sense, our compassion, our empathy, our sense of vulnerability, our sensitivity. And Pisces, the kind of shadow side of Pisces that we have to watch out for, because everything kind of has a light and a shadow, is that Pisces can sometimes be ungrounded. It could be impractical, and it can be a bit disoriented. That's one quality of mutability. And also, Pisces rules illusion, and it also rules disillusion. So being so kind of disoriented or disillusioned with reality and wanting to escape reality. And Pisces sometimes can signify the ways, sometimes the dysfunctional ways that people try and escape reality, whether that's through certain forms of addiction, whether that's through trying to access altered states of consciousness, and that sometimes can be the shadow side of Pisces. So if we combine the keywords that we have for Saturn, and we combine the keywords that we have for Pisces, some concepts that come out of those keyword combinations: spiritual discipline. So maybe as a natal Saturn and Pisces, spiritual discipline is an area where you can lean into, specifically as we go into our Saturn return. Various spiritual practices that require dedication, which is a Saturn word, and it can also be a Pisces word, that Pisces can be very devoted and want to kind of surrender itself to something. And so maybe practices that require a lot of spiritual discipline may be an area where there is Saturnian growth. Growth through emotional challenges. So having to tap into that Piscean capacity for empathy and feeling, and really tapping into your kind of universal sense of compassion can be both a challenge, but also an opportunity for growth in the area of life where you have Saturn. Saturn and Pisces may show up as struggling with empathy. You could be too empathetic and lack boundaries, and kind of feel like you're taking on way too many people's emotions and way too much on the kind of emotional plane. It can also look like a lack of boundary. It can also look like, a fear of vulnerability. So Saturn can also represent our fears, because fears psychologically are limitations, right? When we fear something, we are that Saturn to ourselves of stopping ourselves from doing something, saying, I don't really know about that. And so a Saturn in Pisces may be a fear of vulnerability and having to work through that, the emotional challenges of birth that comes through working through that. One thing I've noticed with people who have, a lot of people, not everyone, this doesn't apply to everyone, it doesn't need to apply to everybody. But with people who have a Saturn in Pisces, particularly if you have a mutable sun or moon, so if you have sun or moon in Pisces, Virgo, Gemini, or Sagittarius, you may have experienced an emotionally absent father, and or you might have experienced your primary caregiver or caregivers as weak, quotes, weak on discipline. And this is because Saturn represents the principle of authority, and it can represent our first kind of encounters with authority figures in our lives, which for many of us is our primary caregivers. And in Pisces, which again is this mutable sign that lacks boundaries, that is, more emotional, intuitive than it is maybe really structured and finite and definite. We may have experienced that in our primary, we may have experienced Saturn and Pisces through our primary caregivers as primary caregivers who may have struggled in their own ways and for various reasons to bring that Saturnian structure in a definite or finite way into our lives. And it's an area, depending on where you have Saturn and Pisces, depending on the condition of Saturn, other things in your chart, it's probably, it might be, and again, this doesn't apply to everybody. It doesn't need to apply to everybody. If it doesn't apply to you, don't internalize it in any way. Huge disclaimer, but it may be an area where we have Saturn and Pisces where we need to do some reparenting work for ourselves. And where we can draw on maybe those Saturn and Piscean gifts, again, the spiritual, the empathetic, the emotional, to guide us in that reparenting work. So now that we've talked about Saturn and Pisces, and for those of us who are natal Saturn and Pisces, maybe some of these themes and these topics that we've discussed already are starting to really resonate with you, and you're starting to kind of see how they show up in your life, or how you live out these themes in your own life. We'll move on to talking about the houses in astrology. And so some people may already know a lot about houses. Some people may know nothing at all about houses. And this is just, again, could be a much longer discussion, much longer presentation, much longer class, but very kind of quickly, the houses in astrology, there are 12. They correlate in a lot of ways to the 12 signs of the zodiac, although they are not exactly the same thing. They do correlate. So if we think about the planets as kind of the personalities, they're the agents, they have an agenda, they do something. And we think about the sign as kind of the quality, the texture, the flavor, the medium through which the personality of the planet expresses itself or tries to kind of carry out its agenda, then the houses are the very specific area of your life within the natal chart where that sign planet combination is activating and where it's most kind of showing up. So take a moment to, if you know your birth time, if you don't, it's totally fine. But if you know your birth time, take a moment to look at your chart, find your Saturn position, find your natal Saturn and Pisces position, and see what house your Saturn is in. So I'm not sure what the kids are using nowadays to cafe. I use cafe astrology. I know there's CoStar, but you use whatever you use to figure out what house 1 through 12 your Saturn and Pisces is in. So here's a brief kind of overview of the houses now that people have figured out what house their Saturn is in. So the first house is your personal presentation and your personal presence, and also your physical appearance come in the first house. The second house is your resources and your values. It is the house where the capacities that live in your second house are the capacities you use to get what it is that you need materially in life. The third house is your communicative projects. So writing, communicating, talking, discussing the things you want to learn about, the things you read about, the kind of knowledge or information that you take in, and also navigating your immediate environment. And this is shows up a lot, or this is like strongly correlated too with like urban environments and like neighborhoods. The fourth house is your family of origin and your relationship to your family of origin. And it also is creating home, particularly the physical like structure of home and your attention to their physical structure of home. The fifth house is creative projects, joy, fun, and pleasure. Romance and dating also live in the fifth house. Risk taking also lives in the fifth house. Children and relationship to children also lives in the fifth house, and hobbies. So things that you do for fun live in the fifth house. The sixth house, your daily routines and habits, areas of self-improvement, health, and the physical body also live in the sixth house. Things that you do with some sense of obligation live in the sixth house as well. Health routines also, did I say that? Health routines also live in the sixth house. Seventh house is one-on-one relationships, partnerships. This can be romantic partnerships. They can also be business partnerships, often live in the seventh house, as well as sometimes like best friendships, like really close friendships that can feel like partnerships, also can live in the seventh house. Eighth house is shared resources and created families. And it's a house of emotional interdependence. And so that can be really anybody that any kind of relationship that where you're sharing kind of life responsibilities with each other can exist in the eighth house. Ninth house is higher knowledge, wisdom. Also travel exists in the ninth house. Engagement with the other, engagement with things that are foreign or kind of expand your like knowledge can live in the ninth house. 10th house, career, vocation, a secure place in the world, or engagement with the broader world or the broader society. Also a sense of like duty, obligation can be in the 10th house. 11th house, aspirations and goals, your humanitarian ideals, your social life and your social connections. One way I heard the 11th house described as like your Facebook friends, right? The broadest kind of group of people socially that you are connected to, the 11th house. And then the 12th house is a very complicated house, but it can represent a lot of things. It could represent the parts of you that you give away in a more transpersonal sense to a larger, broader collective. It could represent letting go of ego, creating a lasting legacy out there in the world. It could also be places where you experience isolation, where you retreat, where you live more privately, more out of the public life. 12th house is very complicated. If you have Saturn in the 12th house, it's kind of a complicated place to have planets, but a very beautiful but complicated placement. So again, looking at your own Saturn and Pisces placement, figuring out what house it's in, and we'll actually do an activity here. So we'll take our keywords that we used for Saturn. So remembering again that Saturn is a capacity to do something and then combine it with our Pisces keywords, remembering that Pisces is a style, an emotive, well, Pisces is emotive, but it's the style or quality of how that planet like carries out its agenda. And then the house is a particular area or location in your life where that capacity is most activated. So create a statement where you are blending the keywords for the planet, Saturn, the sign Pisces, and the specific house that you have Saturn and Pisces in. And I can do an example. My Saturn and Pisces is in my 6th house. And so for me, I wrote growth through spiritual discipline in areas of my daily routines leads to greater empathy and spiritual connection and self-improvement. And then another kind of statement I wrote was my ability to find spiritual connection through engagement and discipline of my physical body. And for me, that last one, spiritual connection through engagement and discipline of a physical body, is actually like very, very true for me. I'm like a very intense yogi, and I have been for the past 4 years now. And so that like really resonates with me. So everyone can take a moment to write their own statement and kind of play with the keywords, mix and match them. Don't kind of just write one statement and you're like, is this true? I don't know. Like play around with the keywords and kind of see how in your life these themes show up for you. So now that we've talked about the natal Saturn and Pisces, let's talk about the return, the big topic that everybody is here to discuss and is curious about. So basic kind of background knowledge. What is a return? What's a planetary return? So a planetary return is when a planet returns to the same sign as it was in a particular time that you're trying to mark. So in terms of a natal return, it's when a planet returns to the same place, the same degree and sign that it was at the time of your birth. So Saturn specifically spends 2.5 years in each sign. That means it returns to the same sign every 28 to 30 years. So the Saturn return is when Saturn returns back to the sign that it was in at the time of your birth. So for us, natal Saturn in Pisces, when we were born, Saturn was in Pisces. And now it's been 28 and some change years, and Saturn is about to go back into Pisces in March of 2023. And that marks for us our natal Saturn return. So a return is a kind of transit, which just basically means like a transit is just basically like when planets move from one sign to the other. Very basic definition. What happens during a return is the external manifestations of our particular natal, particular aspect of our natal chart externally starts to magnify or highlight an internal process of psycho-spiritual, as I talked about in astrology, of our own personal psycho-spiritual development. So basically, the themes that we just talked about of our natal Saturn and Pisces start to magnify and highlight and become more kind of dominant or present in our lives and in what we have to deal with and confront externally to us as a part of our own psycho-spiritual, psychosocial development. And what happens in a planetary return is the theme of that planet is highlighted more and more and more in our lives. So for our Saturn return, the theme of Saturn is going to be magnified and highlighted during our Saturn return. So the themes that we already talked about, maturation, adulting, crossing the threshold. The first Saturn return represents crossing the threshold out of late adolescence and into full adulthood. Saturn return can be reckoning with how our life decisions thus far have kind of set the stage for the next phase of our lives. Saturn return, remembering it's the principle of father time and the principle of maturation, it could mean realizing maybe for the first time that some doors are closing as we've made choices and decisions to walk through other doors. The way I like to think about it, or the way it's been explained to me, because I'm about to experience it, the way it's been explained to me is Saturn return is like a final exam. If you studied, you'll probably do well. If you didn't, you might still pass, but you might kind of struggle in that exam. And if you fail, or you fail certain parts of it, you might have to redo some of those same lessons in the next 28-year cycle. So that's the thing about astrology and the cyclical nature of how we mark time in astrology, is that the whole idea of a return is that we kind of went through all the signs. Our Saturn went through all the signs, and in the next 28-year cycle, it's going to go through all the signs again. And if we kind of did well in the 28-year cycle, we get like the next level of challenges in the next cycle. However, if we kind of didn't do as well, we stumbled a little bit, maybe not stumbled a little bit, but if we didn't do as well, maybe didn't learn all the lessons we needed to learn, in the next 28-year cycle, we might have to repeat some of those same lessons over and over again. And I think astrology and astrological time really helped me better understand why in life it can feel like we often are having to learn the same lessons over and over and over again. And in some ways, that's just kind of our fate. That's kind of our destiny, and our natal chart tells us that and predicts that for us. But in other ways, we have a lot of choice and we have a lot of agency to say, or to relate to those cycles and say, okay, I've kind of passed this lesson. I've kind of learned what I needed to learn, and I'm ready to take on like the next level of this, or the higher, elevated, higher resonant version of this. And that's what our Saturn and Pisces, or really any of our natal positions, teach us, right? They teach us that there's a spectrum of possibility of how we can express our certain natal capacities, and we can evolve, and we can elevate these positions. But it requires that we kind of get to know and we get in touch with what the quality of that natal position is. So our Saturn return, as we said, is going to be Saturn moving into Pisces. It's currently in Aquarius, has been for the last 2 years now. And we'll move into Pisces in March, and that will kind of mark the beginning of our Saturn in Pisces return for those of us who are Saturn in Pisces. I want to take a moment to reflect on current transits that are happening right now. But I think if we kind of sit with and reflect on and think about how these transits have mapped onto our lives and to our kind of natal Saturn and Pisces capacities that we talked about, what kind of lessons and what kind of opportunities we can glean from that reflection. So Neptune has been in Pisces since 2011, and it will transit out of Pisces in 2026. And this is really significant because Neptune is considered, so, if people know anything about kind of rulerships, not completely necessary for this presentation, but helpful. Neptune is the modern ruler of Pisces. The traditional ruler is Jupiter. And this is the first time that Neptune has been in Pisces since the 1800s. And I think, maybe this is wrong, but I think it's the first time that Neptune has been in Pisces since humans discovered Neptune, since humans were able to see Neptune with a telescope and assigned it as the modern ruler of Pisces. So super significant time that we're living in, that Neptune has been in Pisces. I think that Neptune and Pisces has really ushered in, the light and the shadow. Neptune and Pisces has really ushered in an era where people are much more interested in spirituality and kind of alternative forms of spirituality. People are much more interested in kind of the mystical and the cosmological. I think the shadow of Neptune and Pisces, which we've been heavily experiencing and heavily been in, is Neptune's ability as a planet to kind of blur the boundaries, blur the edges, kind of say, turn everything upside down and kind of say, everything is everything, therefore nothing means anything anymore. Again, the shadow side of Pisces and kind of Neptune and its relationship to Pisces, the kind of modern disillusionment that we're experiencing. I think Neptune and Pisces has really ushered in an era of disinformation and misinformation, because it is this idea that like truth is relative and you can kind of believe whatever you want, that in some ways has led to like an explosive interest in astrology, but in other ways, as we know in our popular culture, has been deeply problematic in other ways. So another significant transit, Uranus has been in Taurus since 2018, and it will be there in until 2026. Jupiter was in Capricorn in 2020, and in that time, it conjuncted Pluto. And a lot of astrologers believe that the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction that happened in summer of 2020 aligned and correlated very, very well with the uprisings, the Black Lives Matter global protests that happened in 2020. Jupiter and Saturn conjuncted in Aquarius at the end of 2020. They both moved out of Capricorn. Saturn was a Capricorn. It conjuncted Pluto at the beginning of 2020 and correlated very strongly with the beginning of the pandemic and the beginning of the lockdowns. Both planets moved out of Capricorn, conjuncted in Aquarius in 2020, and that was considered a very, very major Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And the reason why is because Jupiter and Saturn conjunct every 20 years, but before 2020, they were only conjuncting in Earth signs. For about 200 years, they were conjuncting in Earth signs. And in 2020, when they conjuncted, they started a new 200-year cycle where the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions will be happening in air signs. And so a lot of astrologers really felt like that conjunction was very, very, very significant. Then Jupiter transited in Pisces, which we'll talk about the three kind of Jupiter and Pisces transits we've experienced in summer of 2021. Jupiter sextiled Uranus in February of 2022, and Jupiter conjuncted Neptune in April of this year. Which is a very significant transit because, again, like Neptune hasn't been in Pisces since the 1800s. I think Jupiter conjuncted Neptune in Pisces in like the 1850s. That was the last time we had that conjunction. Jupiter is the traditional ruler of Pisces. So it was the ruler of Pisces for like thousands of years before humans knew anything about Neptune. And so the two rulers of Pisces, its modern ruler and its traditional ruler, conjuncted in the sign that it rules, and hugely significant. I think it really did open up this kind of energetic portal that we're in now, where people are just deeply kind of interested, I think, in the spiritual and the metaphysical. And yeah, I think my work and kind of my kind of engagement with astrology has been given a lot of cosmic cosmic energy and cosmic burst leading up to and kind of while we're still in the still under the influence of that transit. So talking about Jupiter and Pisces, as I said, Jupiter is the traditional ruler of Pisces, which means when a planet rules a sign, it means it has a strong affinity for that sign. Again, planets have an agenda. They want to do something agentful in our lives and in our like individual lives and collectively. And when they're in the sign that they rule, there's an idea that they have more power and they have more kind of ability to carry out their agenda. And Jupiter, in a lot of ways, is as often contrasted within our kind of popular discourse, and this is kind of the cultural cultural bias of our culture, that Jupiter in a lot of ways is contrasted to Saturn. While Saturn is growth through hard work, Jupiter is growth through faith, right? Jupiter is believe in yourself, you can do it, right? Versus Saturn is like, I don't know, maybe you can't do it. While Saturn is delayed gratification, Jupiter is getting your gifts now. So Jupiter is giving you opportunities and giving you what you want, what you need right now. While Saturn is natural time and fealty to the gods, which we talked about when we talked about the mythology around Saturn, Jupiter is man is his own god. Believe in yourself. And I use those pronouns in that gendered language very intentionally. Jupiter is, we are our own creators. We are the ones that make everything every good thing that we have possible, right? That's the Jupiterian principle. The shadow of Jupiter can be excess, overdoing it. One way that one astrologer describes Jupiter that I really like is Jupiter will give you lots of opportunities. They may not all be good opportunities. They may not all be the right opportunity, but you'll get lots of opportunities. And another excess of Jupiter can be taking gifts for granted, right? That the Saturnian principle is, you know what is valuable because you have worked for it, you've sweat for it, you've put your all into it. Whereas Jupiter can be things kind of landing at your front door, and they could be the biggest, most important, most significant gift, but because it just landed at your front door, you're kind of taking it for granted. You're not really using it to the fullest extent. And that could be a real shadow of Jupiter and a real challenge for people who have Jupiter really prominent in their chart. And so if we think about Jupiter being in Pisces for as long as it's been, since 2021, so for a year and a half now, in the sign of its domicile, and the opportunities that have come into our lives in the particular area of life, going back to the house that we have Pisces in. If we think about Jupiter being in Pisces for a year and a half, right before Saturn goes into Pisces and we experience our return, we can maybe reflect on and meditate on how the Jupiter themes, what has kind of been given to us? What are some of the gifts that we've been able to explore? What are the things that have kind of landed on our front door in the area of life with Pisces that maybe we'll have to work on refining and work on really maybe having to sweat for a little bit in order for those gifts to sustain themselves and to last through the Saturn and Pisces cycle. So Jupiter, in its kind of latest transits in Pisces, has kind of been in Pisces in 3 seasons. Literally, it's been seasons. That we can, with some intention, maybe reflect on those 3 seasons, what was happening in that time period for us that was Jupiter in nature, and how those are illuminating the themes that might come up for us again during our Saturn return. So Saturn first transited into Pisces around the summer of 2021. Then it left around the end of the summer, around July in 2021. Then Jupiter went back into Pisces at the end of 2021, beginning of 2022. It stayed there for most of winter and most of spring before it left Pisces again, May of 2021. And then the last kind of season of Jupiter Pisces that we had started the end of October of this year and is about to end in, depending on when you're watching this recording, is going to end this week. So I was reflecting personally on the Jupiter and Pisces transits and the different kind of moments that I was in when Jupiter was in Pisces. And the key words that I came up with for myself, thinking about kind of that first season of Jupiter Pisces, the second season, and the third season. And the 3 key words I came up with was, for the first season was exuberance. Felt a lot of exuberance in that time period. For the second season, the word I came up with was hope. I felt a lot of hope. And for the third season that we're in right now, I feel a lot of kind of expectation, like I'm waiting with bated breath for something. So there's a lot of buildup, there's a lot of expectation that I have. So maybe you take a moment to think about these 3 distinct seasons that Jupiter has been in Pisces. Think about how that Pisces capacity shows up in your own life based on the house positions that we talked about previously. Think about what Jupiter is inviting in through opportunities, through kind of abundant opportunity, and reflect on how Saturn maybe in the next season will, through more Saturnian capacities, grow or refine those opportunities that Jupiter has offered in the last year and a half. So thank you all for hanging out with me and listening to this recording and nerding out on astrology with me, which is one of my favorite things to do. This is the end of our presentation. I hope that you learned something and took something meaningful away from this presentation. To close us out today, I will leave you with this question that I hope you take a moment to reflect on. How can we use current transits to prepare for our upcoming Saturn return? So this recording is being offered for free, but I do accept donations on a sliding scale basis from $10 to $50. Anything that you can offer would be greatly appreciated. And also, if you're interested in diving a little bit deeper into your own chart and into your own kind of planets and aspects, and how various transits that are upcoming are going to show up for you, you can also book a chart reading with me. Link is in my Instagram bio, I believe. Thank you so much and take care.